The government's given our supermarket duopoly a firm warning: change at pace or face regulation. So when will we see any price changes, and will that help our grocery bills? Acting Prime Minister Grant Robertson joins us on AM this morning. Thank you very much for being with us, Minister. If I can start by asking, because I imagine you've done the numbers, what percentage do you want supermarket prices to come down by?
Oh, yeah, well, look, we haven't done a specific number like that because I think if I did, obviously New Zealanders would think, well, you know, is that enough? Could it be more? We want to make sure that there is competition in the supermarket sector, and we simply haven't had that. The more competitors we get in, the more pressure there'll be to reduce prices. And we think that we're addressing, you know, two of the really big issues here for a competitor: the land to actually build a supermarket, and we've introduced legislation to stop the land banking that supermarkets have been doing, and the wholesale market, the things that would, the regulations that will mean that actually a competitor can have goods that they put on their shelves. Those two things will facilitate supermarkets coming in, and that's what will see prices go down.
Okay, so this threat of regulation, at what point then does that kick in if you don't have a kind of set target for the supermarkets to reach?
We've said that we'll have that regulatory backstop in place by the end of the year if we haven't been able to get an agreement from the duopoly to open up their wholesale offering to make sure that those competitors can get in there. There's a lot of work to do to design that scheme properly, and we've obviously seen some reaction from the duopoly already with some of the gestures they've made around prices, but not having a regulatory backstop like this means that we would be relying on their goodwill. We need to seek action from them rather than goodwill, and if we don't see that action by the end of the year, that regulatory backstop will be in place.
But it's not a definite?
Well, if we can get what we need from them, a commitment and a guarantee that that wholesale market will be opened up, then we won't need to go to the regulatory result. But if they don't, and we don't see that action through the year, we're now designing that regulatory backstop as we speak.
What other sectors should be worried by this, by seeing the supermarkets, the duopoly, put on notice? What other sectors should be worried that they might be next?
Well, the Commerce Commission did what's called a market study, and that's why we've got this information, and all of the actions you're now seeing are a result of that. We've already done one of those in the petrol area, and the next one of those is in building supplies. Similarly to groceries, New Zealanders pay way too much for our basic building supplies relative to other countries, and so that's the Commerce Commission's next piece of work, and we'll follow up on that once we get their report.
Okay, I just want to turn to the Prime Minister and the delegation in the US now. We're hearing this morning that a third member of the delegation has tested positive for COVID with a PCR test. What more can you tell us about that?
Look, I haven't got any further information on that. Obviously, a couple of people have already tested positive. That's not a huge surprise. COVID is very much still around in the United States, and there are strict protocols around people when they go into the White House, obviously testing negative. The Prime Minister's had her bout of COVID. She's fine. She's there. That's obviously the most significant thing in terms of the meeting with President Biden, and I'm sure others from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and within the delegation will be there to support her.
Just back here, is it still the case that the official health advice from the government is that if you're a close contact of somebody with COVID, you have to isolate for 7 days?
It remains that you're a household contact. I'm not sure what you mean by the definition of close contact, but if you are a household contact, yeah, that is still the advice, yes.
Okay, so the delegation that is travelling overseas that are part of making these rules here in New Zealand, a government delegation, if the rules are there because of the health advice you set in your own country, why aren't they isolating for 7 days if they've been travelling very closely with people who are getting COVID?
When you're in a country, you obviously deal with the rules and the regulations of the country you're in. In terms of those people returning to New Zealand, we still have the pre-departure testing regime, which means before they come back into New Zealand, they're going to need to have a clear result, a negative test. While they're in the United States of America, they're dealing with that. But those who've tested positive, as far as I'm aware, are isolating right now as per the protocols of the places that they're in.
Do you think it makes sense that for people who set these rules then go overseas and don't follow the rules, which are based on the health advice, I guess, that they're setting for the rest of the country here?
Well, they are following the rules. They're following the rules for the country that they're in, and when they return to New Zealand, they'll follow the rules for New Zealand. They won't get to come back to New Zealand until they've had a clear test, so everybody can feel safe and secure in that knowledge.
Okay, so do you think that the 7 days isolation might be revised here soon?
We continue to take advice from our health officials on what they believe to be the correct approach. They have continued to advise us that 7 days is the appropriate approach for New Zealand, and that's what we'll keep doing. Different countries do have different rules, and many New Zealanders are now experiencing that as they travel around. But as I say, those who have tested positive in the US, I'm aware, are isolating as we speak.
Gun control is likely to come up in this meeting with President Biden and the Prime Minister tomorrow, given its prominence in the news agenda over there. What do you say to several frontline officers that have written into our program saying they feel it's a bit rich for the Prime Minister to be talking about gun control and what we've done here in New Zealand when just in Auckland they're investigating 20 shootings, potentially gang-related, in the last couple of weeks?
Look, when the Prime Minister spoke in her speech at Harvard, she was clear that New Zealand's not perfect. You know, we have our own issues that we need to deal with. In response to the March 15th terrorist attack, we did move swiftly to ban semi-automatic weapons. The presence of other weapons, and indeed some of those weapons in our community, is something that we're dealing with right now and we have to keep working through. So I don't think the Prime Minister was saying anything other than the fact that we do need to take action, that action needs to be sustained, and that's the work that's now going on. And I know you've had Commissioner Costa on the program. It's the work that the police are continuing to do to make sure that we get on top of the issues involving gangs, and obviously many of them involve guns as well.
And one of the issues that the Police Commissioner raised this morning is that there will be changes, or they're looking at fine-tuning the policy around police pursuits. Does that sound like a good way to tackle the spike in crime we're seeing recently?
Well, we have to give the police all of the tools that they need to be able to take on anyone who's breaking the law. Police pursuit policy has changed at different times over the years to make sure that it not only keeps the community safe, police safe, but enables them to catch up with criminals. So obviously we listen to the advice on that, and we'll take any suggestions that the police have on board. That's only one element, though, isn't it, of what we need to do here. We have dedicated parts of our police force now focused on this. We've seen Operation Tauwhero, which has seen, I think, about 1,600 weapons seized and about 1,300 arrests. We just have to make sure we get on top of these gangs and that they are not causing the stress that I know that they are for many Aucklanders at the moment.
I want to talk a bit about politics, campaign politics at the moment. Lately there's been a flurry of ads on the New Zealand Labour Party page, and one of them of which was authorised by yourself. If we can have a look at that picture. It says, you'll know this one, it says, the cost of living crisis, that's how we'll win this election. There's a picture of Christopher Luxon there. What's your issue with that quote?
Well, the cost of living crisis is not about politics. The cost of living crisis is about households in New Zealand who are struggling to make ends meet because we've got this massive global inflation spike. Christopher Luxon just seems to see it as some sort of political gain, and I think it's worth highlighting that to New Zealanders, and also highlighting at the same time that our response has been to step up, cut the price of public transport in half, cut the price of petrol, give people a $350 cost of living payment. This is a serious issue, and it seemed to us that Mr Luxon simply saw it as politics.
So when Labor was in opposition and there was a housing crisis that you were trying to get the National Party to admit at that time, was it not fair to say that that was a political issue?
Well, Mr Luxon's got to stand by the statement he made. He stood up at a National Party conference over the weekend and said the cost of living crisis is how we're going to win the election.
Have you never used a social issue for political gain?
New Zealanders.
Has the Labor Party never used a social issue for political gain?
To make that kind of comment. Well, Mr Luxon has to stand up for those comments, and we would have had to have stood up for any comments we made at the time. This is happening right now. Someone has to hold Mr Luxon to account, and we'll do that.
Has the Labor Party never used a social issue for political gain?
I'm in politics because I want people's lives to improve and be better. Every single day I get up and I come into this building and I go out into the community to try to do that. Of course, when it comes to election time, we have to put ourselves out there and see whether the public will support us. But right now, we have a cost of living crisis for a lot of New Zealanders. We've stepped up to the plate to help them deal with that, and we saw Mr Luxon play politics.
So isn't what Mr Luxon is doing is putting an issue out there, which was the cost of living crisis, and seeing what the public responds to, just as you said yourself that you do. They're putting out the cost of living crisis and saying, if the public responds, that's how we'll win the election.
Mr Luxon has to explain himself as to why he sees the cost of living crisis as connected to him winning the next election. He's the one that drew that connection.
I would say a lot of New Zealanders would feel that the cost of living crisis is key to the next election.
I think a lot of New Zealanders will feel that addressing the cost of living crisis is important to their day-to-day grocery bills, what they pay at the petrol pump.
Which
That's
would
what
drive who they vote for.
That's why we've put that forward. That's what we're focused on. That's why we put that forward. It just sounds to us like Mr Luxon thinks it's a political game, and it's not.
In terms of political games, and I know the Prime Minister herself has spoken a lot previously about personality politics, and when Labour was in opposition in 2017, the whole idea around the campaign was that she would be relentlessly positive. Now that you're in government, does the campaign strategy change?
You would have seen, as I think you mentioned, that there is a lot of material that's produced by the Labour Party for social media. Over the last few weeks, I reckon there's probably been dozens and dozens of things that promote the positive stuff that we're doing in the budget.
So John Key said earlier that this looks like a government that's worried.
No, this is a government that wants to make sure that we get our program out there, and there are dozens and dozens of the things promoting the positive things that we're doing in the budget, and there is a handful of things that are holding the national opposition to account, because somebody does have to do that.
Acting Prime Minister Grant Robertson, thanks very much for your time this morning.